One of the biggest bottlenecks in the expansion of nuclear power generation capacity and the deployment of the small modular reactors SMRs, for the advanced modular reactors AMRs, is not the physics. It's to do with the paperwork associated with the regulatory processes of licensing. Now, this paperwork and the safety case means that you have to go through hundreds of thousands of pages of legal documentation, the safety case, environmental impact analysis, and so on. At Urjanova, we are building new tools to address this problem of licensing and the time and the money it takes in the licensing and the documentation around new nuclear power plants. In addition, because we have these advanced nuclear technologies, you will have an additional role of monitoring and ongoing let's say, regulatory compliance that is totally new, and we are trying to address that. My name is Rishi, and I'm building Nova CVS, and in this channel, I talk about my journey in building this. If you are new, you can take a look at this, the history of the channel, and you will see things that I talk about, example, comparison of a regulatory documentation, site selection, and so on. If you like the content of this channel and if you would like to talk about something specific, please like and subscribe and share it with some of the people that you would know who might be interested in this. So let's begin. So as I said, if you are new, you can just go to the white paper link here, and you can see here, essentially, we are going to work on the site and the siting aspect of the deployment, and you can see the white paper and the summary and so on. What I talk about is this integrated golden thread of regulatory documentation from the neutronics plant, site, and the regulation themselves. So let's begin. I'm going to go to my Nova CVS page. By now, you should be familiar with this. Today, I'm going to talk to you about nuclear power plant site validation and finding new sites. Now, in this case, we're going to use the case of the UK, which had a new, let's say, policy, national policy. It is called EN7. It is different from EN6 in that it allows a flexible, developer-led criteria-based siting. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you can take a look at the EN6, let's say, regulations, and then the newer EN7 ones. But long story short, you now have a way for developer-led and a flexible siting criteria. And I'm going to show you how some of these newer tools help with site characterization, finding the site, and also, let's say, making a comparative analysis. So this is interesting if you are an energy developer, if you're trying to find locations for a new site, and also building the regulatory documentation for the site itself. So in this case, we're going to use the GDA, let's say, process, which is obviously very interesting because it is public and it has a lot of role for how the site and the generic site envelope is characterized. So in this case, because we are using the GDA process and the focus is on UK and specifically England and Wales, let's try to find two sites or two site candidates that we could work with. Now, in Nova CVS, you have a differentiation between a site candidate and a geo boundary, which we'll get into. A candidate site is just a site that is interesting, and you can do some kind of a very basic, let's say, siting and characterization for it. So in this case, you have to think about things like proximity to roads. Does the site have an active seismic fault? Is it close to a flooding zone? And so on. Of course, there are a lot of details as far as EN6 and EN7 are concerned, but let's just take a look at one of the site. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to use these, let's say, proposed or just these kind of fictional sites, but you can use it for real sites as well. The goal of this is to show you how this works, and then we can talk about how it works when you have real sites and the real GIS data. So what you're not seeing in this case is the backend GIS data that I already have. So for example, we have data about roads, we have data about areas of AO and Bs, basically. Then we have flood zones, then we have population zones, and so on. So all of these are sort of mentioned in EN6 and EN7. And the idea is that you have these data sets loaded, and you can assess a candidate against them. So the goal of this is to have build an engine to from the very beginning where you're characterizing a site and then moving it forward. One of the other things about this EN6 and EN7 is concerned is basically there are some sites which are inherently better than other sites. In the context of if the site already has a nuclear power plant, then expanding it is a little bit easier versus finding a totally new site. But one of the things about the small and modular reactors is that the criteria is slightly different. If you say that they're going to be used for example, industrial heat, or let's say powering a data center, then they will have a different siting criteria, which is perhaps nearer to the population. Maybe the power outputs are not that high, and so on. And so because the technology of nuclear power generation is changing, EN7 was introduced to make the EN6 process a little bit flexible. Now, we talk about the UK, but really you can use this for any other jurisdiction with their, let's say, regulations. And so if we look at, again, some of the past videos, I have shown you how you can compare the IAEA, the UK, and, for example, the Belgium regulatory regimes in a three-way comparison. For this, because we are talking about candidate sites, we want to focus a little bit on the UK. So, for example, I'm just going to place a pin, let's say, over here, and I'm just going to call it the first site, or site A. Obviously, I'm not going to use the real names, because the real, let's say, sites will need a little bit more thorough study, but I just wanted to show you how this works. In this case, we have an SMR, and then you have a use case of, let's say, powering the grid. So then I say create a candidate. I wait for a second. Essentially, what you can see here is that a set of GIS operations have been done in the backend. You have the two zones, the 5 kilometers buffer and the 30 kilometer buffer, according to the IAEA regulation. And then Nova CVS has generated a set of checks. For example, the flood zone, it is no flood zone intersection. For example, there is no major issue with the seismic site, for example, here. And then there is an issue with the road link. So basically, this site at a very, very, let's say, basic level has been characterized against proximity to some things. Now, as Nova CVS develops, we'll have a much longer list. You can imagine, for example, more layers and so on. But the idea here is that you can see some very basic checks. And therefore, because you have a basic check, you can develop, let's say, a score associated with that site. And these are, let's say, fairly straightforward. You have some critical checks, and then you have some exclusion zones and so on. Then you can develop a score for it. So this is, for example, site A. In this case, let's find us another site, perhaps on the western coast. I'm just, as I said, making some of these sites up. I'm going to just place, for example, this is site number B, and it's the same thing, the grid location. And then I'm going to say, create a candidate. Now here we have a second site, which, as you can see, passes all the criteria, including things like water and composite scores and the grid and so on. And you can also see, for example, these are the buffer zones and so on. So you have, for example, site A and site B, two candidate or potential sites, and you have it assessed at a very basic level on some exclusion criteria and some, let's say, proximity to water and water availability and so on. Now, here you see this promote to geoboundary. When you get into the geoboundary, then you are sort of getting into the generic site envelope and doing some of the advanced, let's say, site characterization, which you will talk about in subsequent videos. For the moment, what I want to do is just compare, for example, site A and site B. So now you can see here, our site B came up with a score of 52 and site A with 35. Obviously, site site B is better than site B. And as we can see, one of the main criteria being the road link, and of course, which site B fails on. And you have the composite score, and here you can talk about how something is, let's say, improved or not improved. The idea for this is to develop sort of these kind of candidate sites. And as you progress and talk about site licensing or a generic site envelope, you develop all the documentation via, let's say, this kind of a system where the GIS analysis, the regulations are in place. Again, this is just an example of how site candidates can be analyzed before they are moved forward. So in this case, we are talking about the site part of the Nova CVS tooling. As I sort of progress in this video series, I'm going to talk to you about how, for example, then you can graduate a site from a candidate to a geo boundary and have all the different, let's say, hazards and so on associated with the site, and then conduct a very simple risk assessment and mitigation and so on for a site. And the idea is, because this is all being done in the background, not the GIS system is not here. You already have an existing GIS system against which all of this is compared. These, let's say, geo boundaries are then further progressed into candidate sites. And for example, the external hazards and so on documentation is generated eventually. So we'll cover that as we progress in this series. Now you can do other things like add AI elements to it and so on, which we will talk about down the line. So that's all I just wanted to share with you on this month's update. I wanted to focus on, let's say, candidate sites and thinking about where some of these new power plants will be deployed and a step-by-step way of doing this. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I continue to talk about this aspect of licensing and the regulatory, let's say, processes associated with license licensing. And the focus is on sites and the, let's say, the site characterization and this kind of a generic site envelope links to it. Thank you very much. See you on the next time.